My name is Daniel Solomon Holland. I am an MFA candidate in the School of Performing Arts here at Virginia Tech, and I'm studying technical directing. I served as the technical director for the show of Oedipus this spring in 2023. And the technical director is responsible for all the scenic elements in a production, in a theatrical production. There's typically a designer who gives the aesthetic view, typically in the form of a rendering. And then there's a technical directing team, in this case it was myself and Gada, who work with the designer to implement that design. So in this show, we had a number of scenic elements, including a large staircase, a skyscraper, some body bag shelves, like a living room area, and the most technically complicated version was a trapdoor. So the trapdoor by nature, because it's automated, is the crux of that complexity. In theater, we use automation to make scene changes go more smoothly, add certain mystic elements as things move without anybody touching them, and generally to add a certain high level of spectacle for our productions. So first and foremost, the trapdoor could have been solved in multiple ways. A typical trapdoor would open, if my hand is the trapdoor, it would open at the wrist, like this. But in this case, we actually moved the pivot forward so it could pivot around that, the whole thing. And by doing so, we allowed ourselves to put a point at the back of the trapdoor to pull down on. Now, it would take a lot of force because the trapdoor is heavy, but we would be able to pull it open using that. The original idea for this effect was to have a person underneath the stage with a rope to pull on the trapdoor to allow it to open. So the first thing that I did in the design of this trapdoor is decide how it's going to move. We know it wants to pivot on an axis that's set forward. We arbitrarily chose a foot, so 12 inches to set forward this axle. And from that point on, it was loading it up into a software. I use AutoCAD, but some kind of drafting software. And in 3 dimensions, I found where each beam of steel would go to assemble a frame to hold the trapdoor in place, and to hold what we call sheaves, S-H-E-A-V-E, or pulleys. And these sheaves would guide the wire rope from the motor, from the Creative Connors deck winch, through a short path and into what we call the guide, which was then attached to a dog, which was then attached to an arm, which was then attached to the trapdoor. It sounds complicated, but it's actually pretty intuitive once you sit down with it. The main idea is that when a trapdoor pivots, the motion that it creates is a circle, but our cable is going to go from point A to point B in a straight line. If we wanted it to curve, in fact, when you track things on a curved segment, you actually do a lot of short straight lines. So in this case, we had one short straight line, and we needed some way to convert that linear energy into a rotational version. And so we used an arm to attach to the back of the trapdoor so it could swing freely, and it could always bridge the gap between the rotating version and the straight version. And then we created what's called a dog. The dog is essentially an interface between the piece of scenery that's moving and the cable. So we had a small, about a 4-inch long piece of steel that was welded to have 2 C-channels facing outwards. And those C-channels latched onto 2 pieces of plastic, high-density plastic. We chose plastic to minimize friction. And then through that dog, we ran our cable. So the dog's path along the guide was set in line with the pulleys that were point A and point B. So pulley A, pulley B, we had a cable going between them, and attached to that cable was our dog. And the dog slid along 2 parallel guides, and as it moved in a linear form, it pulled the arm with it, which forced the trapdoor into a rotational path along the axes that we determined. And all of this allowed for about 10 seconds of motion in a show twice. And it sounds complicated for a really like small effect, but that's the beauty of doing automation, is the audience never needs to know how complicated it is below the stage. All they need to know is just need to see this magical moment of this trapdoor opening and a person climbing out. It's visceral, and it's impressive, and it's exciting. And you pair it with lights and sound and good acting and good directing and costumes and everything, and it becomes a really wonderful moment.